On the morning of July 29th, 1950, Carol Sarant discovered that her husband had vanished in the night, leaving behind only a brief note on the kitchen table. Alfred Sarant was a 32-year-old engineer with a security clearance who worked on classified radar systems for the U.S. military. The note, fewer than 50 words, told Carol not to try to find him. It did not explain where he was going or why. Carol would not hear from her husband. Carol would not hear from her husband again for more than 40 years. When she finally learned what had happened, she would discover that Alfred had spent those decades living under a false name in the Soviet Union, building the very weapons systems designed to defeat American technology. The FBI investigation that followed would eventually reveal not just one missing engineer, but a systematic pipeline that transferred American military technology directly into Soviet hands. A pipeline that had been operating undetected for years and that would ultimately advance Soviet radar, communications, and computer capabilities by an estimated 5 to 7 years. This is the documented story of how two American engineers, Alfred Sarant and Joel Barr, disappeared in 1950 and surfaced years later as key architects of Soviet military electronics and of the families they destroyed in the process. Before we continue with how this disappearance unraveled into one of the Cold War's most consequential technology transfers, if you're interested in the documented stories of espionage operations and their human cost, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We research these cases from declassified archives and bring you the full story every week. Now, let's examine who Alfred Sarant was before that July morning. Alfred Philip Sarant had been born in 1918 in the Bronx, New York, the son of Greek immigrants. His father, Philip Sarant, had arrived in the United States in 1910, working initially as a laborer before establishing a small business repairing and selling radios. Alfred showed early aptitude for understanding how electronic devices worked, spending hours in his father's shop taking apart radios and reassembling them, studying circuit diagrams, teaching himself the principles of electrical engineering through direct experimentation. He attended Cooper Union in Manhattan, one of the few colleges in New York City that offered free tuition to qualified students. He studied electrical engineering, graduating in 1940 with strong academic credentials and practical skills that were becoming increasingly valuable as the United States prepared for possible involvement in World War II. After graduation, he was hired by Western Electric, the manufacturing subsidiary of the Bell Telephone Company, where he worked on military communications equipment, including components for the SCR-584 radar system, one of the most advanced anti-aircraft fire control radars developed during the war. In 1941, Alfred met Carol Appel at a social gathering in New York City. Carol, then 20 years old, was working as a secretary and taking evening classes. They married in 1943, during the height of World War II. Alfred was deferred from military service because his engineering work was classified as essential to the war effort. He worked long hours developing and testing communications systems, earning a reputation among colleagues as technically brilliant but socially difficult, prone to becoming so absorbed in technical problems that he sometimes ignored administrative requirements and social niceties. Their first daughter, Carol, was born in 1945, shortly after the war ended. Their second daughter, Susan, was born in 1947. The family lived initially in Queens, then moved to Ithaca in 1948, when Carol enrolled at Cornell University to complete her undergraduate degree. Alfred commuted to New York City for work several days a week, a grueling schedule that required him to take early morning trains and return late in the evening. Carol's later testimony to FBI investigators, documented in case file 65-14603, described the marriage as troubled from the beginning. Alfred was often distant and preoccupied. He held political views that Carol found extreme. He spoke admiringly of the Soviet Union's economic system, criticized American capitalism, and expressed belief that socialism represented humanity's future. These views were not particularly unusual in certain New York City intellectual circles in the 1940s, particularly among people who had lived through the Great Depression and who saw Soviet industrialization as a potential model for economic development. But Alfred's views appeared to go beyond intellectual interest. He subscribed to communist publications, including the Daily Worker. He attended meetings that Carol suspected were organized by Communist Party members or sympathizers. What Carol did not know, what she would not learn until decades later, was that Alfred's involvement with communist networks extended far beyond attending meetings and reading publications. He had been actively engaged, since at least 1944, in passing classified technical information to Soviet intelligence. Alfred Sarant's closest friend and frequent collaborator during these years was Joel Barr, another engineer who had graduated from the City College of New York in 1933. Barr, 6 years older than Sarant, had worked at several defense contractors during World War II, including a position at the U.S. Signal Corps Engineering Laboratories at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where he had access to classified information about the SCR-268 and SCR-584 radar systems, radio communications equipment, and proximity fuse technologies that had revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare. Barr and Sarant had met in the early 1940s through mutual friends in New York's leftist political circles. They discovered they shared both technical interests and political convictions. They began collaborating on various projects, sometimes meeting in Sarant's apartment or in Barr's apartment in Greenwich Village to discuss electronics, experiment with circuits, and build prototype devices. FBI surveillance reports compiled years later and declassified in the 1990s document that these sessions frequently included a third person, Julius Rosenberg, an electrical engineer who worked for the U.S. Army Signal Corps and who was, unknown to most people who knew him, coordinating an espionage network that passed American military and atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Julius Rosenberg, 5 years older than Sarant, had graduated from City College of New York in 1939 with a degree in electrical engineering. He had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while still in college and had spent the war years systematically identifying other engineers and scientists who might be willing to provide classified information to the Soviet Union. Rosenberg was not a spy in the glamorous sense often depicted in fiction. He did not engage in dramatic acts of theft or deception. Instead, he operated as what intelligence professionals call a talent spotter and handler, recruiting sympathetic individuals who had access to classified information and organizing the transfer of that information through carefully structured channels. Sarant and Barr fit Rosenberg's recruitment profile perfectly. Both were talented engineers with security clearances. Both had access to classified military technology. Both held political views sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Both were willing, when approached by Rosenberg in approximately 1944, to provide technical information about the systems they worked on. The information Sarant and Barr provided during the mid to late 1940s focused primarily on radar and communications technology. The United States had made significant advances in these fields during World War II, developing the cavity magnetron that enabled microwave radar, the SCR-584 gun-laying radar system that could track aircraft with unprecedented accuracy. VT proximity fuses that used miniaturized radar to detonate anti-aircraft shells at optimal distance from targets. and secure communication systems, including early frequency hopping technologies. These innovations gave American and Allied forces substantial advantages during the war and continued to provide military superiority in the early Cold War period. Declassified National Security Agency analysis of VENONA intercepts encrypted Soviet intelligence communications that American cryptographers had been intercepting and attempting to decrypt since 1943, reveals that Sarant appears in at least 3 separate messages sent between 1944 and 1948 under the cover name Hughes. Barr appears under the cover name Scout in messages dating from 1944 to 1947. These intercepts document the transfer of technical information about radar systems, though the VENONA program remained so highly classified that its intelligence could not be used as evidence in court without revealing to the Soviet Union that their supposedly secure communications had been compromised. Sarant and Barr's contributions to Soviet intelligence consisted primarily of technical documents, circuit diagrams, and design specifications. They photographed documents using Minox cameras provided by their handlers, returning the originals to their proper files before they were missed. Later, Soviet intelligence documents that became available after the Cold War ended indicate that Sarant was particularly valuable because of his ability to explain complex technical concepts clearly and to identify which specific aspects of American technology would be most useful for Soviet engineers attempting to develop comparable systems. Barr contributed detailed information about the SCR-584 radar system, including its operating frequency of 2.7 to 2.9 GHz, its range capabilities of up to 70,000 yards for aircraft tracking, and its conical scanning technique for accurate angle tracking. Neither Sarant nor Barr was directly paid large sums for this information. Soviet intelligence practice during this period generally avoided making large cash payments to ideologically motivated sources, reasoning that such payments might corrupt the source's motivations or make them more vulnerable to detection. Instead, both men received modest payments described as reimbursements for expenses, along with assurances that their contributions were helping to build a more just and peaceful world by allowing the Soviet Union to match American military capabilities and thus reduce the risk of American aggression. This arrangement continued from approximately 1944 until early 1950, without detection by American counterintelligence. Sarant and Barr were careful in their methods. They did not remove large numbers of documents from their workplaces at once. They met with Rosenberg or other handlers in unremarkable locations, parks, cafeterias, private apartments, where their presence would attract no attention. They maintained their ordinary lives, their ordinary jobs, their ordinary social connections. But by early 1950, the network was beginning to unravel. On February 3, 1950, Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb, was arrested in England and confessed to passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union through a courier network. Fuchs's confession led British and American intelligence agencies to identify his American contact, a chemist named Harry Gold. Gold's arrest in May 1950 led to the identification of David Greenglass, a U.S. Army machinist who had worked at Los Alamos and who had passed atomic information through Gold to Soviet intelligence. Greenglass, facing prosecution, began cooperating with the FBI and identified his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, as the person who had recruited him into espionage. The FBI had actually been aware of Rosenberg's possible involvement in Soviet espionage since at least 1947, based on the VENONA intercepts. However, VENONA material could not be used as evidence in court. revealing that American cryptographers had broken Soviet codes would immediately alert Moscow to change their encryption systems, destroying an intelligence source that was still producing valuable information about ongoing Soviet espionage operations. The FBI needed independent evidence that could be presented in court without compromising VENONA. Greenglass's testimony provided that evidence for Rosenberg's involvement in atomic espionage. Greenglass also mentioned during his FBI interrogations that his brother-in-law had referred to other engineers who were providing technical information. He did not know their names or specific details, but he had the impression that Rosenberg was coordinating multiple sources beyond the atomic espionage network. The FBI began intensive surveillance of Julius Rosenberg in May 1950. Agents documented his movements, photographed the people he met with, installed wiretaps on his telephone, and began building files on his known associates. Among those associates were Alfred Sarant and Joel Barr. On June 16, 1950, FBI agents conducting surveillance observed Julius Rosenberg meeting with Alfred Sarant in a cafeteria near Penn Station in Manhattan. The meeting lasted roughly 40 minutes. Surveillance photographs taken with telephoto lenses showed the two men in intense conversation, leaning close across the table. The content of that conversation was not recorded, but based on what happened afterward. FBI investigators believe Rosenberg warned Sarant that the network was compromised and that arrests were imminent. 1 week later, on June 23, 1950, FBI surveillance teams observed Rosenberg meeting with Joel Barr at a different location in Manhattan. Again, the meeting was photographed, but the conversation was not overheard. Joel Barr left New York on May 6, 1950, actually before the June 23 meeting, suggesting he may have received warning even earlier through other channels. He told his mother he was taking a vacation to Europe to visit relatives and see Paris. He sailed from New York aboard a French passenger ship, carrying 2 suitcases and several notebooks. Barr's mother later told FBI agents that her son had seemed anxious and distracted in the weeks before his departure, but had not explained why. She had assumed the European trip was simply a much-needed vacation for a man who had been working long hours on technical projects. Joel Barr would never return to the United States. Alfred Sarant did not leave immediately. For nearly 2 months after Rosenberg's warning, he continued his normal routine, commuting to work, spending time with his family at the Centerport cottage, showing no obvious signs that anything was wrong. But FBI surveillance logs indicate that during this period, Sarant made several unusual activities. On July 11, 1950, he visited a passport office in Manhattan and obtained travel documents, claiming he was planning a vacation to Canada. On July 14 and July 18, he visited several banks and closed accounts, withdrawing around $3,200 in cash, roughly equivalent to 6 months of his salary. On July 21, he was observed meeting with an unidentified individual in Central Park, though agents could not get close enough to photograph the second person or overhear their conversation. Then, on the night of July 28, 1950, Alfred Sarant disappeared. What actually happened that night has been reconstructed by intelligence analysts from multiple sources, including later Soviet intelligence documents, FBI investigative reports, and interviews with individuals who had peripheral knowledge of the escape. Intelligence assessments indicate that Sarant did not flee to a border crossing or an airport, but drove instead to an apartment in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. The apartment belonged to a woman identified in FBI reports as Vivian Glassman, the wife of one of Sarant's engineering colleagues from his defense contractor work. Alfred and Vivian had been having an affair for about 2 years, a relationship that Carol suspected but that Alfred had denied. Vivian had recently given birth to a child fathered by Alfred, creating an impossible situation for everyone involved. Her husband remained unaware of both the affair and the child's true paternity. At the Greenwich Village apartment, Alfred met with Vivian, and they finalized plans that had apparently been developing for weeks. Vivian would leave her husband. She would take the infant with her. She would meet Alfred at a predetermined location, and together they would leave the country. The following morning, July 29, 1950, Carol Sarant found the note in the Centerport cottage kitchen. The note was handwritten on a single sheet of paper. FBI reports based on Carol's testimony indicate it read roughly as follows: "I have to leave and cannot return. Do not try to find me. Take care of the children. I'm sorry." The note was not signed. Carol's discovery of the note began a sequence of events that would occupy FBI investigators for years. She immediately contacted local police, who treated the matter initially as a missing person case. When Carol mentioned that her husband worked on classified military projects, the note Alfred had left. She described the note Alfred had left. She described his political views and his association with Julius Rosenberg and Joel Barr. She mentioned that Alfred had seemed anxious and distracted in the weeks before his disappearance, but had not explained why. She provided photographs of Alfred and a description of what he had been wearing when she last saw him the previous evening: dark slacks, a light-colored shirt, and a gray jacket. She also mentioned something that struck investigators as potentially significant. Alfred had taken his personal engineering notebooks with him. These were notebooks he maintained independently of his work, filled with technical calculations, circuit diagrams, and notes about various projects. Carol had seen the notebooks on his desk days earlier, but they were gone. FBI agents searched both the cottage and the family's home in Ithaca. They found no evidence of where Alfred might have gone. His car was still parked at the cottage. His bank accounts had been closed the previous week. His passport, obtained just 2 weeks earlier, was gone. The search of the Ithaca house revealed something else. In Alfred's home office, agents found subscription cards for communist publications, correspondence with individuals known to the FBI as Communist Party members, and technical books in Russian, a language Carol had not known her husband could read. The investigation expanded rapidly. FBI field offices across the United States were notified to watch for Sarant at airports, train stations, and border crossings. International border controls were alerted. Surveillance was established at locations Sarant had previously visited. Associates and family members were interviewed. On July 17, 1950, 12 days before Sarant disappeared, Julius Rosenberg was arrested by FBI agents at his apartment in New York City and charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. The arrest was based primarily on David Greenglass's testimony about the atomic espionage network, but FBI agents also questioned Rosenberg about his relationships with other engineers, including Sarant and Barr. Rosenberg invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and declined to answer questions. He would maintain his silence about his espionage activities until his execution in June 1953. But Alfred Sarant had already vanished. Intelligence assessments pieced together years later from multiple sources suggest that on July 29, 1950, Alfred and Vivian met at a predetermined location in New York City. From there, they traveled south by bus, avoiding airports and train stations where border alert systems were more robust. Records indicate they crossed into Mexico at Laredo, Texas, sometime in early August 1950. Border control agents at Laredo had been alerted to watch for Alfred Sarant traveling alone, but they were not looking for a couple traveling with an infant. Alfred used his newly obtained passport under his real name, At this point, border agents had been notified, but the full alert system was not yet in place. Vivian used her own passport under her married name, Glassman. From Laredo, Alfred and Vivian traveled deeper into Mexico, eventually reaching Mexico City by mid-August. There, they made contact with Soviet intelligence operatives who had been alerted to expect them. The contact procedures had been established through communications between Julius Rosenberg's network and Soviet intelligence before Rosenberg's arrest. Declassified KGB documents that became available in the 1990s show that the Mexico City station of Soviet intelligence maintained several officers whose primary responsibility was facilitating the exfiltration of compromised sources and defectors from North America. Alfred and Vivian remained in Mexico City for about 3 weeks while arrangements were made for their onward travel. They stayed in a series of safe houses, never remaining in one location for more than a few days. On August 23, 1950, Soviet intelligence records indicate that Alfred Sarant, Vivian Glassman, and their infant child boarded a Soviet freighter in the port of Veracruz on Mexico's Gulf Coast. The ship, which had been carrying industrial equipment from the Soviet Union to Mexico and was returning with a cargo of raw materials, sailed for Murmansk, a Soviet port city in the Arctic Circle. The voyage took nearly 4 weeks. Ship arrived in Murmansk in late September. 1950. Alfred and Vivian were met by representatives from Soviet intelligence and the Ministry of Electronics Industry. Alfred Sarant had reached the Soviet Union. For Carol Sarant and her 2 young daughters, the immediate impact was devastating. Without Alfred's income, Carol had no means to support herself and the children. His bank accounts had been emptied before he fled. His life insurance policy, which might have provided some financial support if he had died, was worthless because he had simply abandoned the family. Carol contacted relatives for help and eventually moved with her daughters back to her parents' home in upstate New York. The FBI's investigation into Sarant's whereabouts continued through the fall and winter of 1950 without success. Agents interviewed dozens of people who had known Sarant, colleagues from Western Electric and other defense contractors, professors from Cooper Union, neighbors from Ithaca and Queens, members of political organizations he had belonged to. The picture that emerged was of a brilliant but socially awkward man with strong political convictions and exceptional technical skills. Several people mentioned that Sarant had expressed admiration for Soviet scientific achievements and had sometimes criticized American foreign policy, but no one reported any knowledge of espionage activities or any indication of where he might have fled. The FBI's working theory, developed by late 1950 and documented in case file summaries, was that Sarant had been warned by Rosenberg that the network was compromised and had fled to the Soviet Union, possibly through Mexico or Canada. Border crossing records were examined for any indication that someone matching Sarant's description had left the United States. Agents discovered the Laredo border crossing in October 1950 by reviewing records, but by that time Sarant had been in the Soviet Union for weeks, and there was no mechanism to retrieve him. Meanwhile, Joel Barr had taken a more circuitous route to his final destination. After sailing to France in May 1950, Barr spent around 3 months in Western Europe, traveling between Paris, Switzerland, and Austria. He told American officials at the U.S. Embassy in Paris that he was touring Europe and planned to visit several countries before returning home. He sent postcards to his mother describing tourist sites and museums. He appeared to be establishing a travel pattern that would not immediately suggest defection. In early September 1950, while supposedly vacationing in Austria, Barr crossed the border into Czechoslovakia, then under Soviet control. From Prague, he was transported by Soviet intelligence operatives to East Germany, and from there by train to Moscow. He arrived in the Soviet capital in mid-September 1950, about 1 week before Sarant's ship reached Murmansk. Both men were considered significant acquisitions by Soviet intelligence and the Soviet electronics industry. The information they had provided during their years as sources had been valuable, but their potential value as resident experts who could work directly with Soviet engineers was even greater. The Soviet Union in 1950 was attempting to rapidly modernize its military technology, particularly in areas like radar, communications, and electronic warfare, where the United States maintained clear advantages. Having American engineers who understood how these systems worked and who could help Soviet engineers develop comparable or superior systems was a major strategic priority. Sarant and Barr were debriefed extensively by KGB officers over a period of several months. These debriefings, Soviet intelligence documents reveal, focused on several areas: the technical information they had accessed during their years working in American defense industries, the current state of American radar and communications technology as of 1950, the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of existing American systems, the direction of American research and development based on what they had observed, and the names and potential vulnerabilities of other engineers who might be recruited. Both men cooperated fully with these debriefings. They provided detailed technical information, drew circuit diagrams from memory, explained design principles and manufacturing techniques, and offered assessments of what technologies the Soviet Union should prioritize developing. Declassified, CIA damage assessments prepared in the 1990s after Soviet documents became available concluded that the information provided by Sarant and Barr during these debriefings gave Soviet engineers crucial insights into American radar design philosophy, signal processing techniques, and electronic countermeasures. Information that would influence Soviet military electronics development for the next decade. After the initial debriefing period, which lasted until early 1951, both men were integrated into the Soviet electronics industry. They were not permitted to work in Moscow or other major cities where they might attract attention from Western intelligence agencies or journalists. Instead, they were sent to Leningrad, where they were given positions at Scientific Research Institute No. 2, a facility that developed radar and communication systems for military applications. To avoid detection, both men were given new identities with carefully constructed backgrounds. Alfred Sarant became Philip Georgievich Staros, taking a Russian version of his father's first name and adopting a surname that suggested Greek heritage, a plausible background for someone living in the Soviet Union, which had a small but established Greek community. His official biography claimed he was born in Greece in 1918 and had emigrated to the Soviet Union in the 1930s to escape fascism. Joel Barr became Joseph Veniaminovich Berg, taking a Russian version of his given name and a surname that could be either Russian or German. His official biography claimed he was born in Germany in 1912 and had come to the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. Vivian Glassman accompanied Alfred to Leningrad under the name Lydia Staros. Their relationship was recognized by Soviet authorities, though they could not legally marry because Vivian was still married to her American husband. They were assigned a 3-room apartment in a building designated for technical specialists, relatively comfortable by Soviet standards, with consistent heat and running water, though modest compared to what they had known in the United States. For Joel Barr, now Joseph Berg, the adjustment was considerably more difficult. He was 38 years old when he arrived in the Soviet Union, unmarried, with no family. He spoke no Russian initially and found the Soviet system frustrating and bureaucratic. Interviews he gave decades later to researchers studying Cold War defectors reveal that he experienced periods of severe depression during his first years in Leningrad, questioning whether he had made the right decision in defecting and whether his political ideals matched the reality of Soviet life. He found the Soviet electronics industry backward in many respects, hampered by shortages of quality components, inefficient bureaucratic planning, and suspicion of new ideas that deviated from established practices. But both men had skills that the Soviet electronics industry desperately needed. By 1952, Philip Staros had been appointed as a senior engineer at Scientific Research Institute No. 2, leading a team focused on improving Soviet radar systems. Joseph Berg worked in a similar capacity on communication security systems. Their initial work focused on reverse engineering American radar systems that the Soviet Union had obtained through various means, captured equipment from the Korean War, purchases through third countries, samples provided by other espionage operations. Soviet engineers were tasked with understanding how these systems worked and developing Soviet equivalents or improvements. Staros and Berg's detailed knowledge of American design principles and manufacturing techniques proved invaluable. Technical documents from the period that were declassified after the Soviet Union's collapse show that Staros made particularly significant contributions to the development of Soviet microwave radar systems. He worked on the 1RS-1 early warning radar system, which entered service in the mid-1950s and could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 300 kilometers. He contributed to the development of electronic countermeasures for protecting Soviet aircraft from American radar-guided missiles. He helped establish quality control procedures and testing protocols that were uncommon in Soviet industry, but that improved the reliability of complex electronic systems. Berg contributed to communications security systems, including the development of frequency-hopping radio systems that made Soviet military communications more difficult to intercept and jam. He worked on radio navigation technologies that improved the accuracy of Soviet aircraft navigation systems. Both men were productive members of the Soviet technical community. They published papers in Soviet technical journals under their assumed names. They trained Soviet engineers in modern design techniques, component selection, and testing methodologies. They participated in technical conferences and review boards. By the mid-1950s, they had become, to all external appearances, established Soviet electronics experts with no apparent connection to the West. But they lived under constant supervision. Soviet intelligence maintained files on both men, monitoring their activities, screening their correspondence, and tracking their social contacts. They were never fully trusted, both because they were foreign defectors and because Soviet authorities maintained intense paranoia about potential double agents. They were not permitted to travel outside the Soviet Union. They were discouraged from forming close friendships with Soviet citizens who did not have security clearances. Their apartments were almost certainly equipped with listening devices. Their mail was opened and read before being delivered. They were also prohibited from contacting anyone in the United States. Philip Staros, Alfred Sarant, had left behind 2 daughters he would never see again. He received no information about their lives, their education, their struggles growing up without a father. For all practical purposes, he had erased himself from their existence and they from his. Back in the United States, Carol Sarant faced the challenge of rebuilding her life. She could not legally divorce Alfred because doing so would have required information about his whereabouts or proof of his death, neither of which was available. She remained technically married to a man who had abandoned her and disappeared. She supported herself and her daughters through secretarial work while completing her college degree at Cornell, which she finished in 1953. Later interviews with family members reveal that she told her daughters that their father had gone away, but provided few details, partly because she herself knew so little about why he had left or where he had gone. Carol, the older daughter, who had been 5 when her father disappeared, retained some memories of him, playing in the yard, sitting at the dinner table, his distracted manner. Susan, who had been only 3, had almost no direct memories and knew her father primarily through photographs and her mother's carefully limited explanations. Both girls grew up in their grandparents' house in upstate New York, attending local schools where other children sometimes asked uncomfortable questions about where their father was. Carol Sarant developed a standard response. He had to go away for work and would not be coming back. The FBI periodically contacted Carol to ask if she had heard from Alfred or if she had any new information about his whereabouts. These contacts, which continued sporadically through the 1950s and into the 1960s, were painful reminders that her husband was not simply gone, but was wanted by federal authorities, a source of shame and confusion for the entire family. In 1956, when Carol, the older daughter, was 11 years old, she wrote a letter addressed to Alfred Sarant, wherever you are. The letter, which she later shared with researchers, asked simple questions. Where was he? Why had he left them? Did he think about them? Did he love them? Carol asked her mother to mail it. Carol Sarant refused because she had no address to send it to and because she wanted to protect her daughter from the pain of hoping for a response that would never come. Young Carol kept the letter for years, eventually showing it to researchers as an artifact of a childhood shaped by abandonment and unanswerable questions. Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel were executed at Sing Sing Prison in New York on June 19, 1953, maintaining their innocence despite overwhelming evidence of Julius's central role in atomic espionage. Their deaths marked the end of active prosecution efforts related to their network. Many people associated with the Rosenbergs, including those who may have known about Sarant and Barr's activities, invoked Fifth Amendment protections and could not be compelled to testify. The Rosenberg case and its associated investigations had a profound impact on American security procedures, leading to enhanced background check processes, more frequent security reviews for employees with clearances, and stricter protocols for monitoring access to classified information at defense contractors. For Alfred Sarant and Joel Barr, living under assumed names in Leningrad, these American developments were distant echoes reported in Soviet newspapers, which portrayed the Rosenberg executions as martyrdom by a capitalist state terrified of socialist progress. They continued their work developing Soviet military electronics, their contributions hidden behind false identities and security classifications. In the early 1960s, Philip Staros began working on what would become his most significant contribution to Soviet technology: the development of advanced computer systems for military applications. Soviet computer technology had lagged significantly behind American developments throughout the 1950s. The United States had developed the SAGE air defense system, which used hundreds of networked computers to process radar data in real time and coordinate interception of incoming bombers. The Soviet Union had nothing comparable. Soviet military planners recognized that this gap posed serious risks to national defense, particularly as American strategic bombers became more sophisticated and as intercontinental ballistic missiles emerged as delivery systems for nuclear weapons. Staros was appointed to lead a research team at a new facility being established in Leningrad, a city roughly 20 miles northwest of Moscow that was being developed as the Soviet Union's center for microelectronics and computer technology. The facility, known as Scientific Research Institute of Molecular Electronics, brought together Soviet engineers and foreign specialists, including several other Western defectors whose identities remained classified, to develop integrated circuits and computer systems that could match Western capabilities. Later accounts from Soviet engineers who worked with Staros during this period and who were interviewed by researchers after the Cold War ended describe him as demanding and difficult but extraordinarily knowledgeable. He had an encyclopedic understanding of Western electronic design principles and could explain complex concepts with exceptional clarity. He insisted on rigorous testing and quality control procedures that were uncommon in Soviet industry, where pressure to meet production quotas often took precedence over reliability. He pushed teams to meet deadlines and performance specifications that many considered impossible given available resources and components. Between 1962 and 1968, Staros's team developed computer systems that Soviet technical records identify as the 5E92B and related models, which were subsequently integrated into the S-75 VENONA surface-to-air missile system and other air defense networks. Later versions of the computer systems developed under Staros's direction were used in Soviet air defense networks throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Processing radar data from early warning systems and coordinating responses to potential air attacks. Joseph Berg worked on related projects, focusing on secure communication systems and data transmission technologies. He contributed to the development of encrypted communication links between air defense radar stations and central command facilities, systems that needed to rapidly transmit large amounts of data while resisting jamming or interception by American electronic warfare systems. Both men received Soviet honors for their technical contributions, though these awards were never publicized because their true identities remained classified. They received salary increases, better housing allocations, access to special stores where consumer goods unavailable to ordinary Soviet citizens could be purchased using special certificates. They were successful and valued by Soviet standards, but neither man found the satisfaction they had imagined. The Soviet Union's chronic bureaucracy, material shortages, and ideological constraints on innovation created constant frustration, a stark contrast to the idealistic vision that had motivated their betrayal. Staros remained with Lydia, the woman who had been Vivian Glassman. They lived in Leningrad, raising the child they had brought from America, and eventually having additional children born in the Soviet Union. Lydia adapted to Soviet life, learning Russian fluently and maintaining a circle of friends among other technical families. She managed to create a relatively stable domestic environment despite living under constant security scrutiny in a foreign culture. Berg never married in the Soviet Union. He had several romantic relationships over the years, but found it difficult to form lasting attachments. He lived alone in a series of apartments in Leningrad and later Moscow, spending most of his time working or reading. He maintained a collection of Western classical music records obtained through various channels and spent evenings listening to Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart, small connections to the Western culture he had left behind. In 1968, Soviet authorities began developing plans for a massive new computer facility to be built near Yerevan in Soviet Armenia. The facility was intended to become the Soviet Union's primary center for developing advanced computer systems for both military and civilian applications, part of a broader effort to modernize Soviet industrial control systems and scientific research capabilities. Philip Staros was appointed to lead the planning and initial development of this facility based on his success at Leningrad. He moved to Yerevan in 1970, bringing Lydia and their family with him. The Yerevan facility, officially known as the Scientific Research Institute of Mathematical Machines, according to Soviet industrial records, eventually employed more than 10,000 people and became one of the Soviet Union's most important technology centers. Staros served as its chief designer and later as director of research until his retirement in the mid-1970s due to declining health. Under his leadership, the facility developed computer systems that Soviet technical literature identifies as the ES-1035 and related models that were used throughout the Soviet military and civilian economy, including systems for air defense coordination, ballistic missile guidance calculations, industrial automation, and scientific research applications. Declassified CIA damage assessments prepared in the 1990s concluded that these contributions to Soviet military technology were strategically significant. The computer systems developed at Yerevan and the earlier systems developed at Leningrad improved Soviet capabilities in areas where the United States had previously held substantial advantages. While Soviet computers never matched the most advanced American systems in terms of processing speed or miniaturization, they narrowed the gap sufficiently to provide Soviet military planners with tools they desperately needed for coordinating complex air defense networks and processing targeting data for missile systems. The assessment estimated that Sarant and Barr's work combined advanced Soviet radar, communications, and computer capabilities by roughly 5 to 7 years compared to what Soviet engineers would have achieved working independently. This represented a significant strategic advantage for the Soviet Union during a period when electronic warfare capabilities and air defense systems were crucial elements of military planning. But the human cost extended far beyond strategic assessments and technical achievements. In the United States, Carol and Susan Sarant grew into adulthood, carrying the burden of their father's abandonment. Carol, the older daughter, graduated from high school in 1963 and attended a state university, studying elementary education. She married in 1968 and had 3 children. Working as a teacher in upstate New York, later interviews reveal that she struggled throughout her adult life with trust issues in relationships and with persistent questions about why her father had left and what she might have done differently to make him stay. Irrational questions she intellectually knew made no sense but emotionally could not escape. Susan, the younger daughter, graduated from high school in 1965 and worked at various jobs without finding career satisfaction. She married in 1970 and divorced in 1974. She remarried in 1978 and divorced again in 1982. Testimony she later gave to researchers indicates she struggled with depression and alcohol abuse that she attributed in part to childhood trauma and abandonment. She had difficulty forming stable relationships and maintaining employment. She felt that some essential part of herself had been damaged by her father's disappearance and the family shame that followed. Carol Sarant, the mother, now using her maiden name, Carol Appel, lived until 1987, dying at age 66 from complications of diabetes and heart disease. She never remarried. Her daughters later recalled that she never fully recovered from the double trauma of Alfred's abandonment and the subsequent revelation that he had been a spy. She blamed herself for not recognizing signs of his espionage activities, though FBI investigators repeatedly told her that she bore no responsibility and that professional intelligence operatives were trained to conceal such activities even from intimate family members. She worked as a secretary and office manager for various companies, living modestly and maintaining a low profile to avoid attention related to her husband's defection. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Philip Staros and Joseph Berg lived as successful engineers, their technical achievements recognized by the state they had chosen to serve. But they lived false lives under false identities, cut off from their families, their past, their authentic selves. Staros had abandoned 2 daughters he would never see again. Berg had left behind elderly parents who died during his years in the Soviet Union, his mother in 1957, his father in 1963, without knowing what had happened to their son or whether he was alive or dead. Philip Georgievich Staros died on March 18, 1979, at age 61 from complications of heart disease. He was buried in Yerevan under his assumed name. Soviet technical journals published obituaries noting his contributions to Soviet computer technology and air defense systems. The obituaries made no mention of his American origins or his previous identity. Lydia, his companion of nearly 3 decades, survived him by several years, dying in the mid-1980s. Their children, raised as Soviet citizens, knew nothing of their father's American past. The truth about Sarant and Barr's whereabouts began to emerge gradually in the late 1980s and early 1990s as the Soviet Union entered its final years and Cold War-era secrecy began to erode. In 1989, an American researcher studying Soviet computer history noticed an obituary for Philip Georgievich Staros published years earlier in a Soviet technical journal. The researcher was struck by certain details: the timing of Staros's arrival in the Soviet Union, his specialization in radar and communications systems before transitioning to computers, and certain technical approaches in his published papers that seemed influenced by Western design principles rather than Soviet methodologies. The researcher began investigating, comparing what was known about Staros with FBI files on missing American engineers from the 1950s that had been partially declassified. By 1991, the researcher had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to conclude that Philip Georgievich Staros was almost certainly Alfred Philip Sarant. The researcher contacted the FBI, which conducted additional investigation and confirmed, based on biographical details, technical specializations, and other evidence, that Staros and Sarant were indeed the same person. Carol and Susan Sarant were informed by FBI agents in early 1992 that their father had lived in the Soviet Union under the assumed name Philip Staros, had worked on Soviet military technology for nearly 3 decades, and had died 13 years earlier in 1979. The revelation was devastating for both women. They learned that their father had been alive all those years when they had wondered if he might be dead or imprisoned somewhere. They learned that he had built a new life, achieved professional success, raised a second family with the woman he had left their mother for, all while maintaining no contact with the daughters he had abandoned. They learned that he had died without any apparent effort to contact them or explain himself or apologize for destroying their childhood. Carol, the older daughter, was 47 years old when she learned this information. In interviews with researchers, she later described her reaction. "I had spent 40 years wondering where he was and whether he thought about us. When I found out he had been alive that whole time and had never tried to reach us, it was like losing him all over again. Except this time I understood that it was a choice. He chose not to be our father. He chose his political beliefs and his new life over us. That knowledge was harder than not knowing had ever been." Similar research led to the identification of Joseph Veniaminovich Berg as Joel Barr. Berg was still alive when his identity was revealed in 1992. He was 80 years old, living in Moscow in a small apartment, in poor health from emphysema and heart problems. When contacted by American journalists, he initially denied being Joel Barr, but eventually acknowledged his true identity after being shown evidence, including photographs from his youth and details about his family that only the real Joel Barr would know. He granted several interviews in which he defended his decision to spy for the Soviet Union and to defect. He argued that in the early Cold War period, he had genuinely believed American capitalism was leading the world toward nuclear war, and that strengthening the Soviet Union had been necessary to maintain global balance of power and prevent American military dominance from enabling aggressive foreign policy. He maintained that the information he and Sarant provided had helped create strategic stability rather than undermining it. When asked about the people he had left behind, including his elderly parents, who had died without knowing what happened to him, and his friends who felt betrayed, Berg expressed what appeared to be genuine regret. But he also insisted that he had made the right choice, given what he believed at the time and the circumstances he faced. He said that living in the Soviet Union had been difficult and that Soviet reality had not matched his idealistic vision, but that he still believed the fundamental critique of American capitalism that had motivated his actions remained valid. Joel Barr died in Moscow in August 1998 at age 84. Still living under the name Joseph Berg. He was buried in a Moscow cemetery. His obituary in Russian newspapers noted his contributions to Soviet communications technology, but made no mention of his American origins. He died alone, with no family present, having lived more than 60 years in exile. The discovery of what had happened to Sarant and Barr prompted comprehensive reassessments by American intelligence agencies of the damage their espionage and defection had caused. The CIA and FBI prepared detailed classified reports analyzing their contributions to Soviet technology and attempting to quantify how their work had improved Soviet military capabilities relative to what would have occurred without their involvement. These assessments, portions of which were declassified in the late 1990s and early 2000s, concluded that while neither man had single-handedly closed the technology gap between the Soviet Union and the United States, both had made significant contributions that measurably accelerated Soviet developments in radar, communications, and computer systems. The reports noted that systems developed with Sarant and Barr's contributions were used in Soviet air defenses during the Vietnam War, in air defense systems deployed in Middle Eastern countries during Arab-Israeli conflicts, and in command and control systems that remained operational until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The human cost was harder to quantify, but no less real. Carol Sarant, the mother, had lived most of her adult life as a woman whose husband had disappeared, never knowing definitively what happened to him until just 5 years before her own death, unable to move forward fully because she remained legally married to a missing person. Her daughters had grown up with a father-shaped absence in their lives, dealing with shame, confusion, and social stigma. Vivian Glassman's first husband had been betrayed by both his wife and his colleague, left to raise questions about what signs he might have missed and how his life had been destroyed by decisions made without his knowledge. The Sarant and Barr case illustrates aspects of Cold War espionage that are often overlooked in simplified narratives about spies and secrets. It demonstrates how espionage networks operated not primarily through dramatic acts of theft, but through systematic exploitation of access to classified information by ideologically motivated individuals. Sarant and Barr were not glamorous spies conducting daring operations. They were engineers who photographed documents and passed them to handlers, an unglamorous reality that characterized most Cold War espionage. The case also shows how the consequences of espionage extend far beyond the immediate transfer of classified information. The long-term damage came not from what Sarant and Barr stole during their years as active spies, but from their subsequent decades as defectors, helping Soviet engineers develop comparable technology, transferring not just specific pieces of information, but fundamental knowledge about design philosophy, testing methodologies, and quality control practices. The question of whether Sarant and Barr could have chosen differently is impossible to answer definitively. They operated in a context, the early Cold War, with its ideological polarization and nuclear tensions, that shaped what options seemed available and what justifications seemed plausible. They were recruited by a network that skillfully exploited both their political convictions and their personal needs for recognition and purpose. They faced decisions under pressure, with imperfect information, while trying to reconcile competing loyalties. But they made choices. They chose to provide classified information to Soviet intelligence. They chose to continue that relationship for years. They chose to flee when the network was compromised rather than face prosecution. They chose to spend the rest of their lives in the Soviet Union building military technology designed to defeat the country of their birth. They chose not to attempt contact with the families they left behind, even decades later, when the initial danger had passed and when personal letters might have been possible. These choices had consequences that rippled outward for decades, affecting people who had no agency in the decisions but who bore the costs nonetheless. The classified information was eventually declassified. The technology became obsolete. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. But the human damage, the destroyed families, the abandoned children, the lives shaped by betrayal and absence, endured long after the geopolitical context that seemed to justify it all had disappeared into history. Alfred Sarant was 32 years old when he abandoned his family on July 29, 1950. He was 61 when he died in 1979, having spent 29 years living under a false name in a country that was not his own, building weapons systems designed to defeat American technology. His daughter Carol was 34 when her father died. She had lived more of her life without him than with him. She learned of his death only in 1992, 13 years after it occurred, when researchers pieced together the truth from Soviet obituaries and declassified intelligence files. What Alfred Sarant accomplished in those 29 years is documented in Soviet technical journals and classified intelligence assessments, computer systems deployed in air defense networks, contributions to radar coordination systems, training of Soviet engineers in modern design methodologies. What he lost is documented nowhere except in the memories of the daughters who grew up without a father, the wife who spent decades not knowing if she was a widow or an abandoned spouse, and the families destroyed by choices made in the name of political ideologies that seemed, at the time, more important than human relationships. The technology Sarant and Barr helped develop became obsolete within a generation as microelectronics advanced and as digital systems replaced the analog technologies they had worked on. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the Soviet Union's collapse. The ideological conflict that had motivated their espionage and defection dissolved into history. But Carol Sarant never remarried, carrying her husband's abandonment until her death in 1987. Her daughters carried their father's betrayal into their own marriages and their own struggles with trust and abandonment, passing trauma across generations in ways that statistics and damage assessments cannot capture. When Alfred Sarant died in 1979, he died as Philip Staros, honored by the Soviet state for his technical contributions, but mourned by no one who had known Alfred Sarant. He took to his grave whatever rationalizations had allowed him to believe that computer systems and political ideologies mattered more than the children who wrote letters to a father who would never answer, who asked questions that would never be explained, who spent lifetimes trying to understand choices that perhaps even he could not fully explain to himself.